When it comes to leadership in local government, few decisions have a bigger impact than choosing the right executive. Welcome back to AuthentiCity FM, where real conversations meet real leadership in local government. I'm Phil Corrali, joined as always by my co-hosts, the fearlessly frank and endlessly engaging Corey Spiegel, and the sharp-minded, slightly mischievous Mike Sable. Today, we're exploring the ins and outs of recruiting executive leaders in local government, what works, what doesn't, and why it matters. The hiring landscape is shifting. There are fewer candidates. Expectations on both sides are higher than ever, and new tools like AI are changing how searches get done. Whether it's landing a city manager role or filling a key department head position, we'll dig into what it really takes to stand out as a candidate and attract top talent as a community. Let's dive in. Public sector executive recruitment comes with its own set of unique challenges, and today we're joined by someone who knows them inside and out. Charlene Stevens is Vice President of Human Capital at MGT, one of the biggest players in public sector recruitment. She's led teams, driven big change, and even sat in the city manager's chair herself, giving her perspective from both sides of the hiring table. Charlene, welcome to the show. Let's start with your career story and what brought you to the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm excited to be here and a lot of fun to see all of you and to be part of this. So yeah, my career journey, it's interesting because I listened to yours and I learned something about each of you that I hadn't known. My career journey started actually in Kansas with the city of Wichita, Kansas. I like to say, and it's true that I was the first neighborhood assistant they ever hired. There were two of us at the time, and our tagline was, "We're from the city, and we're here to help you." And we really are. And that was our goal, was to look to work with neighborhood associations, different community groups. How could we make the city services for a large city and urban city more relatable, more approachable with individuals? Learned a lot in that role and really enjoyed it. It was kind of a good marriage of some work that I'd done previously in nonprofit and community-based work and city government. Then I spent about 10 years in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So very different, kind of followed what was who was then my fiance and then now my spouse of many years out to Philadelphia. Didn't know anything about it, didn't know anything about the region, but took an opportunity to go there and spent 10 years of my career in a couple of different suburbs of the Philadelphia region. Great mentors, great friends, learned the difference between townships and boroughs, and townships with the first class and second class and such, which is very useful today. And then had an opportunity to go back to Kansas and work literally across the street from the city and in the county, and work for the county government there. And then just kind of my family grew, and young children, and just an opportunity. I'm originally from the upper Midwest. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I had a lot of family in the Twin Cities metro. And so I always wanted to kind of get to Minnesota. And so took an offer and then really kind of purposefully decided to do that with my spouse, that we really needed to do that. And took an opportunity in West Central Minnesota first. And then one in Wilmer, Minnesota, and then one in Cottage Grove, which got me into the Twin Cities metro. And then about 7, 8 years, just needed something different to do. And the folks that had founded what was then GovHR, now MGT, had always approached me about joining their firm. And we talked about it casually and kind of if you ever want to do something else kind of way. And I decided I did want to do something else. And so joined Heidi Voorhees and then Joellen Cadamatoria in what was GovHR. And I've been doing executive recruitment for now almost, since 2019. I guess that's getting close to 7, 8 years now.
That's awesome. So, Charlene, it seems like recruitments and openings happen in a wave. So, can you give us a broad brush of what you're seeing and by level? So, at that top executive level, and then kind of those deputy and assistant roles and department heads, because it seems like it definitely ebbs and flows over time.
Yeah, definitely. And regionally, it ebbs and flows too. I work all over the country, and I can, tell you, like, even regionally, it seems to ebb and flow, where I'll be really busy in one particular part. And some of that maybe is in a metropolitan area. There's a little bit of musical chairs that goes on, as you're kind of familiar, is sometimes somebody moves and then 3 more moves later. So you get a little bit of a wave. Um, we're doing more city administrator, chief administrative officer kind of recruitments than we've done in the past. So we're seeing more of those. Uh, I think some of that is just what we've been talking about for years in the profession, which is the kind of wave of retirements, a generation that's retiring, looking to exit the profession, and we are truly seeing that. Uh, we do, we've done in the last few years 200 plus recruitments as a firm in local government. The chief administrative officer wins maybe are 20, 25 a year. And then we do a lot of, and then a lot of director level. And the hardest at the director level, we say if you have a finance director, be nice to them. They're very hard to find. That also goes along with well, you should really be nice to all your directors and such.
That was for you, Mike.
Yeah. And the public works directors are probably the next in terms of the hardest to fill competition from the private sector as well. And then we've really seen, I guess, too, and not a surprise probably to anybody in local government, public safety, chief of police, those applicant pools are much smaller. So sometimes it's the openings are not as, they change, but the applicant pools have also really changed in terms of the number and the type.
So Charlene, I have a question. I'm going to jump in with a couple of like practical questions. How do you handle a council that might have an internal candidate, but they also want to explore sort of a nationwide search and they want to see what's out there? How do you advise councils on thinking through that issue? And then maybe the second part of that is how do you advise candidates, people maybe looking for that little tension between inside and outside? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that. Obviously, I think if you're an internal candidate, it can be disappointing if they go outside and look for a search. What I do try to share with internal candidates is I think it's an opportunity to really prove and earn the position, and there's some benefits to that. I've even seen in my own career when I was hiring, sometimes internal candidates to which it came easy, maybe weren't the best, at the end of the day. They hadn't really thought about what they needed to do in the job. And sometimes, that search process helps internal candidates really, really think about, do I really want this and what would I do with that? I think in terms of balancing the perspective, first, we want to make sure that the city does want to have a genuine search. If you're going to go out, you really need to be open to all candidates. And I always tell clients, we'll be very fair and candid with your internal applicants. We're going to give them every opportunity to succeed in the process, but they need to go through the process in the same way and the same steps. And so they don't have a leg up in that. I think it can cut both ways too as an internal. Sometimes as an internal, you may be held to a higher standard. And so if you're an internal, you know the organization, and sometimes making sure you demonstrate that can be important in the process and not taking it for granted. And then for external candidates, that is always a question. If they, it's a small world in local government. And I want to be able to say to candidates is that, the city is really open or the community is really open. The board and the governing body truly wants to be open to all candidates and make sure that they really are choosing the best candidate in that process.
Charlene, I want to jump back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, kind of that competition with the private sector, and especially the department head level, but even at the chief administrative officer level, it seems like there's sometimes a desire for governments to go to the private sector and bring somebody in who may not have that traditional government background, or that we're seeing our long tenured government employees jumping to the private sector. What are the reasons behind kind of either side of those that you're seeing in the recruitments that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think the kind of the appeal maybe of a private sector candidate, or what people perceive as the appeal, is that kind of business-like approach, right? They're going to come in and they're going to really be able to straighten out the local government and get things moving. I'm very forthright with governing bodies when they're interested in saying, yep, some candidates might be able to make that transition, but can be very different, right? The public sector is very different from the private sector. I work in the private sector now. I can tell you it's very different in terms of, how we go about things, the transparency, the openness. Not a lot, individuals that have spent a career in the private sector may be surprised to find out, salary information is public. Every decision is public. And so are you comfortable? And I've talked to candidates that have considered making that transition, and just, you got to be comfortable with all of those things. So I think there's a little bit of that appeal that we've heard for years, is that, local government needs to run more like a business. I think it does. I think we have cost centers. We have all the things that a private sector does, and probably have more constraints on us and more challenges than the private sector in that. So I think that's kind of the appeal. I think the other thing, particularly maybe more at a director level, where I think some of that crossover works better, from a public works, from a finance, from an HR. I think we do have to be open to candidates that are coming from non-traditional backgrounds, and not just assume, well, they're from a nonprofit or a private sector and it can't translate, and really have the conversation with potential candidates around about that, and really make sure, because there are some where those skills are really going to translate well. And I think you got to be able to kind of work through that. But it's not the easy fix of, and I think a lot of individuals that maybe start down that path of making the transition from the private to the public sector find out that, like, it's very different to work with elected officials that work in that context, as you all know.
So I want to go back to you talking about the generational shift, and I think COVID probably delayed it a little bit. The market in 2008 delayed it a little bit, but it's definitely here and you see it. What How are councils, especially ones that maybe have some tenure and longevity, who are used to, well, what do you mean we're the greatest? Like, why don't we have, and I think we've seen some headlines, why don't we have 70 candidates? What does that discussion look like when you frame it as kind of resources, right? You're a product, and people are going to decide whether or not they're interested in that product.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at the, job postings in an ICMA newsletter to see how many they are. They go on and on. And that's different than it was a few years ago. And even in my, some years, we used to have applicant pools of 60, 70. For a chief administrative officer, we might have 30, 40. I did do recently a recruitment. It was for a communications position. We had over 150. It was kind of shocking. But, different line of work, great organization, a lot of draws to that, but still 150 was, pretty extensive. But most of the pools are around 30, 40, 50, where we might have had double that. And so I'm always, I'm candid and upfront about that. And that's the changing market. There's more cities, and fewer people are choosing careers in the public sector, and fewer people are choosing to stay in the public sector. And so you have to kind of put your best foot forward, I think. The other thing is to also be open to mentoring candidates and developing candidates. I can't tell you how many times I've done a chief administrative officer search, long tenured, or somebody that's been there 20, 30 years. And, that's what you want. Well, you're not going to hire somebody with 30 years of experience to replace somebody that had 30 years of experience. That's pretty rare, because they're probably looking to retire as well, or they're in their current community and not going to move in there. So reminding them that, the person you had that has 30 years of tenure didn't come to you with 30 years of tenure. They also grew into that role.
So I'll kind of pull on that a little more. What are some of the constraints you're seeing? And I know, as we've all talked, the guys are both in the metros where their careers are built. I've moved around a lot more, and I feel like people willing to make those jumps, those are different decisions maybe in 2025 than they were even in 2010 about
Yeah,
mobility of candidate pools.
yes, very much. As I described my career, I moved around and was willing to do that for opportunities. Moved 3 different states. I don't think that's not as common anymore. Housing market has made it harder. If you have a low interest, mortgage, it's hard to just let that go and get a 5%, 6% mortgage rate. In that timing of people's personal lives. I have kids in high school. One of the reasons I moved in terms of an opportunity in the private sector was that I wasn't going to have to relocate for it because I had kids that were starting to enter high school and I wasn't going to move them. If you are looking to get candidates to move, you got to also be willing to relocate them and help offset some of those costs. And most communities are, but I think those are all kind of critical things in that factor. And then the stability of a governing body.
Can I latch onto that one, Charlene, and ask you a question? So a lot of times you see maybe the same community go through a couple of searches back to back to back. Either they had a bad candidate pool or they had just a string of short tenured managers, and they get sort of a reputation as a place that might be a difficult place to work. How do you advise both? How do you advise the council in that about, okay, so, you're holding up a mirror in some ways and say, maybe you own some of this instability. What's that conversation like in a room? Because I've never seen it. So I got to imagine it's hard. So how do you prepare for it? And then how do you deliver that message to a council?
Very delicately, I think. So I use the same skills I used as an administrator when I had things that people didn't want to hear. Right? It is about helping people see some of the challenges that they have and they present. And what I talk to governing bodies about in that situation, and during my career, I actually worked for a governing body that was known as really difficult and challenging to work with. And it's not a lot of fun for anybody in that situation. So what I talk to them about is if it didn't work out with your prior administrator manager, we don't need to rehash that. What we really need to think about is what candidates are interested in is, can you move forward collectively? Can you move forward together? Can you move forward respectfully from that? Is that people can understand sometimes it's a bad match. Sometimes just in this profession, there's a shelf life. Governing bodies change and it's not anybody's fault. It just doesn't fit anymore. The two sides don't fit together. And I say that as somebody who's gone through that. So I'm not downplaying that or the impact on the individual in that. And so try to focus on, you have an opportunity to kind of set the stage to go forward collectively and also maybe be realistic about the candidates that are going to be attracted. You might have to, take a candidate who has maybe a little less experience than what you're looking for, but maybe can bring, some stability and kind of gather stability and kind of get further down the road, so to speak, and kind of rebuild your reputation and the stability. And with candidates, I think as a recruiter, it's important to be candid with them too about, yep, this governing body does seem to now really want to move forward. They can seem to move forward collectively. And, this is what I've seen. And that's why we spend time with our clients trying to get to understand them, spend the time talking with them to really see, can they kind of align well together around this. And I have seen it work successfully. Sometimes that somebody new comes in and it does help. It does help the governing body and it does help the organization move along. But you do have to be, I think everybody knows it. Back in the day when I was moving around in jobs, you had to look in the newspaper. You had to find the information, right? It was harder. Today, it's all online. So everybody is going to look at it. They're going to look at your meetings. They're going to see how you're acting, or they should. Candidates should, just to understand what that looks like.
So in a case like that, and you're right, I mean, the meetings are all there. Everybody sees it. And I would say probably more often than not, it's not the whole elected body that is disruptive. You probably have one or two provocateurs, let's call them. But what are the questions you're seeing from the candidates at that point because you've worked with the client, you have a little perspective of how they work together. What should a good candidate be asking you if they're really interested? And what kinds of questions are you seeing in those cases?
What are the dynamics of the governing body? How do they interact? Are they open to goal setting? Are they open to some team building? Those are some of the questions that I get asked. Those are some of the questions that candidates should ask is, from your perspective, how do you see this, the profile that was put together, does it really reflect the collective governing body? Is that where they were? And I will say a lot of times when councils, as a recruiter, I talk to a lot of them one-on-one. And a lot of times when I do, they really do have the same things they're looking for. It's about methods, about approaches, about styles, much of what you experience with governing bodies as a s- as a city manager, city administrator, county or chief administrative officer. It's just what you experience, right, in that role. Is that your governing body generally does want to go in the same way, generally has the community's interest at heart. They have some very different ways of doing that, and some maybe are better at articulating it than others, and some maybe have a bigger vision than others. But generally, I find actually they have I find more alignment than they even think they have.
So Charlene, kind of along those lines, as you're looking at this from the vantage point of a candidate, and you're trying to figure out the dynamic, you're trying to understand the community, maybe you're trying to picture yourself in the seat. I think one of the challenges also is really kind of trying to cut through the show. You know, we do it when we're interviewing candidates for positions, right? We're all happy. Everything is great. Oh, this is the best workplace. Everything's fantastic. And yes, you do get into some of the challenges and the unique issues, but I know one of those areas that's just kind of difficult to discern is how real the responses are, and how both sides have the ability to kind of discern what things are really like. What's the recruiter's role to kind of help to cut through that a bit on both sides, right? Because the candidate is going to be patting themselves on the back and saying, I've done all of these fantastic things. The community is saying, oh, this is the place you want to be because of all of these reasons. How do you help bring clarity and reality to both sides?
Yeah, I think the more interaction you can get in a process, informal and formal kind of helps in terms of the candidate side. So even though I think some of the panels can be challenging, and some of whether a community panel, whether it's a director or a staff panel, sometimes the staff panel can be the hardest, I think, uh, to both as a recruiter and as a candidate. I think they can be the hardest in that process. It's a good interaction because it gives you a better sense of the organization. The tour gives you a better sense, all of those. Even some of the things that as a candidate I wasn't overly fond of, I have to say, the meet and greet or the multi-panel process. I think in hindsight and now looking at it, I think it gave me a lot of times a better perspective. And even honestly, I can even look back and say that red flag truly was a red flag. Even if I ignored it, it's like, well, that was there, upon reflection, I kind of saw that in the interview and maybe I didn't pay attention, but now I look back, I'm like, yep, that was there. So kind of also understanding and trusting your instincts in some of those things. I think for the elected officials, and this is kind of harder, sometimes it just depends on the type, it depends on the state and open meeting laws, right? The more interaction. If you can have more than one interview too, right, first and second rounds, you get to see a different part of the candidate. My role is to kind of sometimes, I've had an opportunity to experience the candidates before I've presented them. And are they consistent in this? Or is this consistently how they presented, some of it through the references and such? And sometimes even I think as a recruiter, there are times where I've even clarified just because I'm listening in the um, I'm listening in on the interviews of sitting in, and sometimes people miss something or don't quite hear it right, or I can offer. Well, I'm not sure that's quite what they said. I caught it differently, or this maybe is I think what they were intending, or the experience, and provide a little more context to it because it can be for everyone in those situations. And you've done interviewing too. Sometimes you don't quite catch it. Sometimes it just lands oddly to one person. And then I've even had in debriefs where individuals mix up the candidate and they're very passionate about something somebody said, but it's actually another candidate. And so you get mixed up. And so I think as a recruiter, it's kind of just trying to help clarify things in the process, move things through in the process. I've had candidates that have interviewed very well with me and not interviewed well with the client.
Charlene, for what it's worth, I have always found that my opportunity to debrief with the recruiter when we're using a recruitment firm for a department head position, particularly, is just invaluable because just as you said, you're picking up, you've had conversations with that person one-on-one, and you're seeing them interact with a group and kind of putting those two experiences together. I have always been so fascinated by what the recruiter takes away from those one-on-one discussions. And as somebody who is trying to discern, you think they might be a good fit. They said something you're not sure about. Being able to bounce that off somebody who's had more time with them is just so valuable. And I have to imagine that if a board or council is doing it right, that they're using those opportunities with you or others to kind of do exactly as you just said. Look, did I hear this right? Did I not hear this right? And just adds so much value to the process to have that recruiter perspective.
Yeah, I think it also can provide perspective on some of the other, whether it's community members or whether it's a director panel. I often say to councils, when I was a director or an assistant, the best manager left me alone. That's what I was looking for, was to be left alone. And then I became a chief administrative officer, and that's not really the ideal way to manage people. So, just context what people are looking for. And so consider, sometimes your directors might be looking for something very different than you, the governing body, are looking for and need. So it's input to factor in, but balance that against what you're hearing.
So you've touched on what I would consider kind of the end of the process, but I'd like your perspective on where efficiency and transparency kind of intersect, right? The candidate pools are smaller, people are more discerning because of information being available. Are you seeing a lot of compression? Recruitments used to be a 6 to 9 month thing. And I think in the modern era of talent attraction, that's just unreasonable from a candidate perspective for sure. How are you balancing that, or what are you seeing across the industry?
Yeah, our standard is kind of 90 to 120 days. We really try to get it done in 90 to 120 days. I say you want to move quickly, but not hastily with clients. So we want to move quickly, but we want to also make sure we're not missing steps in the process. One of the kind of key things I think is making sure you have your advertisement out there long enough, and 3 to 4 weeks is kind of the sweet spot. Because if you put it out too short, like 2 weeks, there's a presumption that you aren't really serious in the search. You've already identified your candidate. And so other candidates are not going to apply. They're just going to feel like you're going through the motions. And so there's a sweet spot there. And then it just takes some time to do the due diligence. So the to your point, yeah, you got to move faster. I think you got to also have a schedule at the front end. I really, we we talk about that all the time with our clients. Is I just had an interview earlier today with a potential client, on the timeline and what delays the timeline. Most of the time, the client delays the timeline and such. Yeah, it's turnarounds, getting things back, getting things approved. And I've been on the other side. So I always say that, knowing busy people, busy schedules, we don't want to wait and try to get Phil and Mike and their teams together a week before we want to interview. We want to have those dates kind of locked down early in the process. I like to be able to tell candidates when those dates are when I'm talking to them too. Here's the tentative schedule. It's the week of this. It's the week of this, or these are the dates. So candidates can already tell me, oh, I'm on cruise, so I'm not going to be available. And I'm not saying you have to be, but it's helpful because then I can share that with, Bill and let him know, hey, if this is a candidate you really like, you're going to have to move your interview date, or you're going to have to create another interview date for this candidate. And so that ability to stay on a schedule matters. And I think also the putting together your offer afterwards matters. We certainly talk about keeping candidates warm in the process, keeping them up to date in that process, while having that timeline up front. And really doing your best to adhere to it and adjust quickly if something comes up.
So I have worked with Charlene as one of the hiring panels, and so her emphasis on timelines are real, and she won all of the arguments about why they had to be different than what I had in my head. So when she says that, she means it, and it's real, and she's better at this than we are, so she usually wins out. But you said something interesting I want to touch on, which is okay. So you get to the end of the process, you get the candidate that you want, and the candidate and the governing body are at an impasse on salary or the final deal. Do you have a role in that? Do you advise in that?
Mhm.
Like how does that work sort of behind the scenes for people who might be the next person in your search? How does that work?
Yeah, I think actually, and I do think there's definitely value in having a third party kind of help buffer some of those conversations too, on both sides, both for the candidate and even in my experience as a past candidate working with a recruiter, the recruiter was able to give me some candid advice or just say, hey, I think this will be a deal breaker. How important is it to you? And such, or give context to it. So that third party is helpful to avoid, you just come out of a situation where everybody really likes each other and you don't want to kind of you don't want to do anything to jeopardize that honeymoon. So that's helpful to have a third party in there. But kind of back to your question of when you get at an impasse, I try to first start with both sides. Like, how far apart are you? Are you willing to kind of blow this up over $2,000 or over a week's PTO? I mean, on either side, right? How important is this and the amount and such? And sometimes it's reminding, sometimes even sharing with the client, you're going to spend more going back out on the search if this doesn't come together. And so are you sure you can't, maybe move a little bit or be creative with some things? And I found sometimes simple things. Sometimes relocation appears a barrier until you offer some ways to, okay, well, what if you do relocation, but there's a clawback? Or what if you structure it this way? And so some of those things um, can change the argument. And then kind of with the candidate too, making sure they first of all have realistic expectations. We vet that on the front end too of where their expectations are and what the range is. And so if you're at the top of the range, okay, but if you're 20,000 over, it's probably not going to work out. What are the standards in the industry? I spend a lot of time up front with clients on that. Hey, this is what car allowances are in this region. This is what the expectation. You're not going to hire a chief administrative officer and have them start at the bottom of the vacation scale. So they're going to have to start here. This is what severance is, right? Some places, Minnesota, it's just kind of 6 months. It is what it is. And the candidates that aren't from, it's like that's all you're going to get. Or in Florida, there's limits. That's what you get. Other places it's more negotiable, but what's the standard in the region? And just trying to get both parties to see uh, where it is. And I've told both kind of folks, I'm very clear with candidates, but go back with that. This is going to be a deal breaker. And are you really over something? It's you're kind of get to a point where it's nickel and diming on either side, and it's going to be a deal breaker. So you got to be candid in those situations. And we say it's a Heidi Voorhees statement. You get one bite of the apple too as a candidate. You can't just keep coming back. So put it all like, what do you need? Don't kind of hold something back, and we get all the way done, and then you say, oh, but what if I get this too? So put it out there.
Charlene, I want to take us just slightly back in the process if we can, because this is one of those things that we hear about, and it is communication during the process, right? So that 90 to 100-day window starts when it starts and it ends when it ends, and there are people that come into and out of the process at different points, right? And so one of the things that I will often be talking to a colleague who's in a process, one of the things they'll say is, I haven't heard anything for, a couple weeks. I had a second interview or a last interview, and I just don't know what's how I did. I don't know what's coming next. Like, so what's your process in terms of communicating with those candidates, kind of where they are and whether they're moving forward in that process?
Yeah, I try really hard to communicate, and I really take it from the perspective of, I was a candidate once too. And I think, back in the day, it was so you kind of applied, and if you didn't hear anything, you didn't get the job. You didn't get moved forward. That was kind of how candidates were treated, and it wasn't great. So you want to do better than that. So we have really uh, actually worked on our process a little bit. So we, sometimes used to hold a whole candidate pool and not really, and even when we were screening maybe 12, we didn't always, let the other candidates know they weren't being screened. We try to do that earlier now and just kind of say, hey, you have been selected at this time. If anything changes, we will let you know in that process, and then kind of early release those candidates, if you will. So at least they have feedback and they know where they are in the process. Uh, Once I start interviewing candidates, same kind of thing is once I know they're not moving forward, really you want to have that conversation and tell them they're not selected for the initial, they're not going to, they were selected by the client to move forward, and offer feedback, really try to offer feedback there too, or the opportunity for feedback, what from my perspective, they might be able to do better in that process. And then as the process moves along, just kind of continuing to keep candidates informed. I always say to any candidate that I interview, I was doing a few today, is I do my best. But sometimes schedules slip, they fall behind with the client too, and the client, we're trying to keep things on. If you don't think you're hearing from me and you have a question and you want to reach out, please do. It does not bother me because I'm human and I might get busy and I might have missed that day to get back to the candidate or taken me another day. And so I would say to anybody who isn't hearing, particularly if you're working through a recruitment firm or you've not heard back from the recruiter after you've had the interview, check in with them and just kind of see, hey, what's the status of things? I try to keep, sometimes it is you get down to the finalists and the client's not sure on a candidate, and I'll say, hey, I try to set expectations at the interview stage. They're probably not going to make a decision today. I want to leave space for the client to have room to make a decision. I don't ever want to, it's not a timed event of, hey, you had your interviews, let's make a decision and such. You want to have time for them to feel good about it. So try to set the expectation. They might make a decision today, but probably not. I'll be back in touch with you, in the next couple of days, or I'll let you know the status. And, just even texting candidates to say, hey, they're going to think about it over the weekend and I'll be back in touch with you early next week, let you know the status of things. Candidates appreciate that because nobody wants to kind of wait there and be hanging out there. And I try to also be, mindful of the timing of letting candidates know, especially candidates at the finalist stage who aren't selected. That's a hard, you know, when I call people, and I always say I've been on your side, so I'm not going to try to make this sound better than it is, because it's disappointing. But you have to kind of keep people informed in the process. But definitely reach out for hearing.
I don't envy you in those calls.
That's the least fun part of my job. that is the hardest, and I think it's very personal. We've even had this conversation as recruiters of who likes a phone call and who does not. Right? As a candidate, I kind of felt like just email me if I'm not getting the job because it's awkward. But I call people sometimes maybe hoping I get their voicemail. And so, it's hard because I think that's very personal of how people want to receive that news. And you don't always know that up front, but you have to communicate it.
Having gotten a call or two like that in my life, there was one time where I abruptly ended the call as I realized that I was going to start crying on the phone with the recruiter, and that just was more awkward than anybody needed in that moment. So I get it. I think it's a very emotional space to be in, right? For the candidate who maybe has spent a lot of time, effort, thinks that it really is a possibility, and then it's not, right? And so you're in that that zone of having to be both good news giver and bad news giver. So along that, kind of in that front, or along those lines, with respect to that feedback loop, I think one of the hardest things that I have been asked by candidates who we haven't hired is, why didn't you hire me? And, in that moment, you may be inclined to kind of undersell why. Sometimes it's just, it really comes down to fit, right? Everything on paper or everything seems quite really, really good. There's just something that gnaws at you, and that's hard to say. But how do you entertain that conversation about, what did I do wrong and why didn't this work out, and what should I do better next time?
Yeah, first I give the feedback from my perspective. Kind of, here's what I saw, because I don't want to jeopardize confidentiality of a client or their perspective. But here's where I saw some opportunities you could have improved, or here's where, when I talk with you, I can't. Your energy was just better. They, even on a Zoom, they were good with me, and then flat kind of with the candidate. It's like, wow, you didn't seem to bring the same energy to the interview. You missed a couple opportunities to maybe give some examples, or show the depth of your career. That's a common mistake people make sometimes, is focusing on their most recent position and kind of losing some opportunities on the depth of their career. So I try to be pretty clear with examples on what it was. Sometimes it really is like, you were a great candidate. They just all were great. And so it's hard, because that level, at the level of finalists, always, I just did an interview where we had a question along the lines of, at this point, everyone is qualified for the job. Why are you the best qualified? And so you have to remember that too, as a candidate, that you're not the only qualified applicant. They all are qualified. And so it's about who is the best for that organization at that moment in time and that juncture. And sometimes it's about what they want to mentor, or what they want to, everybody brings some different strengths and where they want to kind of support that growth and where maybe they don't. I've had, both governing bodies and managers say, I don't have time to train somebody. I don't have time to mentor. And that's true, and it's genuine. And so if you really don't, then you need the more experience.
Okay, so this feels a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, where we sort of have the wizard behind the curtain, and you kind of know all of these things. So, so I've been a candidate 6, 7 times, and I've failed, and I've bombed interviews, and I've screwed things up. And so, what are the mistakes that candidates make that, if you're your first time interviewing for the CAO job, or it's your first big interview thing, what are the biggest mistakes people make? And how do I learn from that so I don't make the same mistake again? So if I'm a new person listening to this, what's the biggest mistake and how do I avoid it?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. And I've been a candidate too and made those kind of same mistakes. I think, first of all, it's the not having an example, right? Being superficial in the interview. So people want to know that you've done the work, and you can do the work. So being too superficial, assuming that the resume, or even people's knowledge, if you're local, kind of, they know you, and so they know what you've done. So making that assumption and being too superficial in an interview and not giving enough of a concrete example or a how of something, I think at the other end of the spectrum is kind of going way down in the weeds. And so there's, give an example, but not every minutia to it. Another piece I've seen is people kind of fail on maybe the depth of their experience and kind of putting it all together sometimes, and particularly for a candidate that might be trying to move to a different scale or scope of an organization. So I had an opportunity in my career to work small and work large organizations, and I had a candidate who was fabulous, is fabulous, and a couple times had been an assistant in a larger community and was a manager now in a smaller community. Was trying to move up, was applying for positions as a manager in larger communities. and kept getting overlooked, even though I even would kind of advocate sometimes with would advocate a little bit with the governing bodies of they were an assistant in a similar sized community. They can do this work, but the candidate wasn't always great at illustrating that. And so had, kind of gave that feedback. You got to illustrate the other. You got to go back to some of your assistant role because that's the size of the community you're looking at and kind of tie both pieces together. So sometimes that tying the whole of it, I think, together is it in it. I tell people it's okay to make sure to have notes, right? Have examples and such because it's nervous. You get nervous in an interview. I've done it too. And, the example you wanted doesn't come quite to you, but if you have it on your notes of kind of what am I trying to convey, can be helpful. Not listening and not answering the question, kind of answering another question and just kind of answering your own question instead of, being so focused on your examples that you're not actually tying them to the work is another mistake individuals make. And then just kind of not connecting. You got to be able to make in interviews a bit of a human connection, personal connection. You don't have to have your life story. You don't want to, go into depth. You want to make some kind of personal connection because people are thinking, can I work with this person? Is this somebody I can, drop into their office and have a conversation with? And so being able to have that piece. And then my last would be my last piece of advice is with all of that, still be your authentic, right? You can want the job, but if you have to kind of contort yourself to get the job, it's probably not going to be a good fit at the end of the day.
Well, I appreciate you shamelessly plugging AuthentiCity FM because that's what we're all about here. So I'm going to turn it over to Corey for another question.
So you talked about the availability of information, right? I mean, we are putting our lives out on display through a podcast, and Phil is shamelessly active on LinkedIn, and we are grateful for it. But what does the role of media play and social media, right? So they're very different things. One you can sort of control and curate yourself, but as we talked about in one of the last episodes, what people say about you online nowadays, you have no control over it. And you also don't fight with the media over what they maybe didn't get right. And so how much credence do you give that in the process, and how are your clients viewing that, knowing that more and more cities don't look like the perfect employer anymore?
Right. Well, media and social media is a part of the process. People are going to look at it and people are going to want to know. And so we look at it too when we're looking at candidates. And I always say it's not a disqualifier because everybody in the public is going to have good and bad media and such. And so everybody, they're going to have some negative media. But it's can you explain it? Does it? And then from my perspective, does that explanation sound reasonable? And for people that have had some negative media and maybe have made a misstep, it really is about what did you learn and can you demonstrate you learned from it and then you made a correction to it. I've been a manager in transition and I worked with managers in transition. Everybody plays a role in that breakdown. And so as a manager who's been that, you have to have some self-reflection and demonstrate some self-reflection. And it might have been, maybe it was 70% them, but there's probably 30% maybe it was me. So to have some role in that. So I think that's a piece of it. I think governing bodies have the same kind of challenge. So, what's the media on them? And, how are they, that's what I would say to candidates. Well, this has been my experience with them, and talk with them. And they, some of that is legend, too. I think, sometimes people get kind of an aura or a legend around them. But, from what I've seen, the interaction of the staff, this is, their interactions are positive. But you just have to be able to filter that out on both sides of the equation. But I think you also have to really be mindful of the social media. I am surprised sometimes by what people, maybe put on their social media when you've got a professional kind of, is that what you want to see? Or I used to do some ethics teaching. It's like, a great reputation can be ruined in 5 minutes, right? So just a 5-minute mistake or just something. So I was like, is it worth defending that?
So I want to kind of dive a
And
little
Phil's
bit
media
into
is great.
something. Thank you. I appreciate that. Mike, take a lesson. We're teaching Mike about this new thing called social media that's been invented, and something that he's
I'm pretty
well,
limited with what I do too, outside of LinkedIn, because I'm kind of with Mike. It's like sometimes less is more.
fair. So I want to just dive back into something that we've talked about on this podcast a bit, which is mentorship. And I think in my experience with some of your colleagues, Charlene, Heidi or Katie Rush, I have really looked at them as mentors of mine. They have participated in recruitments that I have been a part of, or they have participated in recruitments for my organization. And taking the opportunity to really kind of dive into, you know, what sort of jobs should I be looking for? What sort of jobs are available? What do you think? And finding a way to spot talent. I think one of the things that recruiters have a unique opportunity to do is to see that person that may not get seen by somebody else because they're in a sub-department head level, a deputy director role. Maybe they're they have a skill set that's undervalued, but they have a really great personality and a really great ability to kind of step into a role. And I've seen recruiters bring those people to me. And I've been one of those people in the past too, where I would never have thought twice about jumping into a recruitment process, but because of that relationship, I was kind of encouraged to do it. And I didn't necessarily get the job, but it was a learning experience. How do you kind of see your role as both the talent spotter and then kind of the person who comes back to somebody and says, I know that last gig didn't work out, but how about this one?
Yeah, I mean, very much the same. And I learned from Heidi, and so I see that, and I had that experience too as a candidate with recruiters in my career. That part of it was even helping a recruiter. Sometimes even helpful to. And I always tell people if you're looking to move or relocate, tell a recruiter that because I don't know. I at a point I was looking to move to Minnesota, and so I reached out to individuals that were doing work in Minnesota and started to have the conversation or and it started with one recruitment, but it was kind of a, hey, I'm interested in this. And so, you know, then they kind of reach out to you like, hey, you're interested. And so having that conversation is first of all helpful too. Candidates shouldn't hesitate to reach out and have the conversation. But I think that is our job sometimes too, is to bring forward a variety of candidates. We really pride ourselves at MGT on bringing forward, a wide, variety of candidates and diverse candidates in a lot of different ways in terms of experience. And so being able to look at somebody's work versus their job title, what they have done and what their job title is and what their responsibilities have been versus maybe I think it's a Heidi phrase, careers are more like lattices than ladders. And so in the, previous previous ways, you used to kind of start off as an intern and then an assistant two and just management analyst and kind of work your way up. That's not very traditional anymore. People move back and forth. So really looking at the work they do and then encouraging, and that's part of even, candidates. I mean, we just talked about when they don't get the job is saying, hey, I'd have you in another recruitment pool. I'll continue to reach out to you for opportunities and, are they interested?
So we're heading into fall election season in many communities around the country, which eventually leads to transitions. If you're a candidate right now, and maybe not an active candidate, but somebody who is thinking about maybe this transition isn't going to be good for my career, I want to get out ahead of a move, or somebody who's ready to make the leap, what advice would you give people kind of right now in this window as we're, about 2 months out from elections and school years are about to start, all of that kind of stuff? What advice would you give to prospective candidates who think they might become part of a pool right about now?
Yeah, I think first be realistic on timing and time frame and update your materials. If you haven't done a resume, sometimes people haven't done a resume in 5, 10, 15 years. And I was one of those too. Refresh the whole format of it. just to be more current, to not look dated in the process too. So if you have a resume that's 20 years old, the format's probably 20 years old, so refresh it. Uh, in that process, really take the opportunity. I used to actually kind of half joke. This started with my husband used to do this, and then it was kind of a half joke with a friend of mine. Is that every year after the first year, just would update my resume to kind of reflect on what I had done and such. And that was a joke of never know, right? You never know when you're going to need to go. But just to having that, and it is helpful to go back and kind of really think about what you've been doing over the last few years and what needs to change and what needs to be refreshed. I think in it, I think I also say, um, as a former manager, don't panic, right? You don't want to just kind of start throwing out resumes. Really come up with a plan of where you want to be, what you want to look at. Try to be strategic in a job search, and then to the time frame. I I tell particular managers in transition that I'm working with, or even just young professionals who are starting their career. Job searches can take 6 months or more, and now to really find the opportunity. Sometimes it can be real short. You get lucky, the job you want, and you get it.
Okay, so Charlene, one of the bits that we have on this show is that local government is maybe at the most sort of 2 degrees of separation, but in most cases, everybody knows everybody. So if you're a young person, right, you're a planner in community development, but you have aspirations of being a city manager, and so you want to get on your radar or any recruiter's radar. What advice do you give them?
First, I'd say just call me, right? I do a lot of the like informal, to Phil's point earlier of mentoring, or just informal resume review, talking to people about, hey, I think I'm interested in this. And I'm always happy to do that for anybody. If anybody in our firm is, first of all, it helps me get to know people that I don't know and get to know talent that I don't know.
Okay, so
And
hold on a second. You
Mhm.
are a big deal in the recruitment world. You really just want people to call you?
That's perfect. Yeah, just, I don't mind. I really don't. Or just LinkedIn. I get requests by LinkedIn and such, and take advantage of that. I think also having individuals, I give early career professionals is that networking, is important. And so try to build your network. So be, active in your professional association. Be, active, if you're a planner and you want to move into community development, first start to have that conversation with your own director and your own, supervisor, right? And what can I do to better prepare myself and get engaged and and then if I want to be in city management, what does that look like? What are some ways to network and understand kind of the role and do some shadowing in that? But yeah, we do as a firm, we'll do informal resume. I'll give candidates feedback on their resume and their cover letters, things like that, after the fact, or just, in the past, I've had candidates that haven't felt like they've gained traction maybe in other searches or such, or just, on their own, what am I missing, in my cover letter? Or what could I do better? It's nice of you to say I'm a big deal. I try to tell
You
my kids that all the
No,
time and
no,
they don't
you are a big deal. This is like, right? I mean, so you led the recruitment for the ICMA CEO and executive director.
I did. I
Like,
won the timeline argument as we discussed earlier.
I still
It
am
was
still
it was it was mutual. It was negotiation.
Yeah, it was. But I mean, so I mean, you really are. I mean, you're a trusted colleague and friend to many of us in the profession, and we appreciate it. So, I really want us to emphasize to people watching this is like they should get to know you. You might not do their recruitment, or you might not be someone that they hire, but I mean, it's an important role, and it's one of the obligations of being a professional is to be engaged with people who are in this profession. It's a
Yeah.
requirement to be successful, to have a good career.
Yeah. And I also, will tell candidates, I'm not doing the search, but it's still a great community. Right? They should have hired me, but they didn't. But that recruiter's good too, and it's a great community. And there's a lot of good. But I want people to find, if I'm or they're doing it on their own, and I think it'd be a good community for you to look at.
Just to circle back on what Mike's point is, which I think is so kind of a part of the ethos of what we're trying to do on this podcast, which is s- people build boxes around themselves and around others where they're like, I could never walk up to Charlene at a conference and introduce myself and say hi, right? Because I don't know her. She doesn't know me. Oh my gosh. I bet. And, you know, I barely talk to Mike. That anxiety is real. It's part of what I've seen in this profession. And I think as I was talking about a few episodes ago, I derive so much joy from when somebody reaches out and says, "Hey, I would really just love to have a conversation with you about the profession, or about, you know, how you got to where you are." And I think it just underscores again, we're all just regular people. There isn't some aura around you or any of us that would keep somebody from being able to just go up and introduce themselves. And I think there's so much value in just kind of saying that out loud. And I appreciate you being as open as you've been to just kind of say, look, I want to get to know you. I want to know if you want a job. I want to know you because
Yeah.
I may be able to find that job for you. Right? It seems so simple, and I think we overcomplicate it so much.
Yeah, and you just, you want to, I want to know people that are kind of looking. I want to know people that I want to meet new talent. I mean, that's my job, is to kind of help find candidates. And the more people you know and have an opportunity to have a conversation with, or have some experience with, or again, I want to see people be successful. Communities, all deserve to be well run. And so you want to see good people, and you want to get good opportunities.
Okay. I feel like we have to cut her loose at some point, but I have like 5 or 6 more questions I'd love to throw out on the table, but I want to, Mike, Corey, any other questions that you want to throw at Charlene?
I answered them all. You guys were
You,
easy.
Charlene, you've been so gracious to spend some time with us and let us pick your brain about recruitment. Again, I think we could keep going for hours on this subject. It's so much a part of the conversation in local government, professional management, to just kind of understand this. And it's changing, right? It's continuing to evolve. I think back to some of the first recruitment processes I was in almost 20 years ago, and it's just such a different world. And we just appreciate the fact that you've given us so much to talk about this evening. So thank you.
Absolutely, I've loved it. I think it's a good opportunity to kind of show a little bit to what Corey might have said earlier, is behind the curtain. Is sometimes that's also the hardest part for candidates their first time. When I was a candidate the first time going through a recruitment process, I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't know the recruiter. And so sometimes demystifying that process is just, it's an opportunity to help individuals, particularly maybe individuals who have a non-traditional background or haven't had as much, kind of formal training or that opportunity. And so, we look good. I always say to a client is, if I made your decision hard, then I've done my job really well. You might not like it because it might leave you with a lot to think about. But if we've done it well, it's supposed to be a hard decision uh, for you. Then, that's our goal, is to really bring talented people forward and help candidates succeed too in that process.
I think that's a really great way to bring this episode to a close. Thank you again, Charlene Stevens from MGT, for joining us on this episode of Authenticity FM. We look forward to getting into more conversations like this in the future. And thanks again for tuning in.